Charlemagne, the emperor who rebuilt Western Europe. Part 1. Europe before Charlemagne. The world into which Charlemagne would be born was a shadow of what it had once been. In the year 476, the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed by a Germanic chieftain, and with that quiet ending, 5 centuries of imperial rule over Western Europe came to a close. The great roads that had bound the empire together fell into disrepair. Cities shrank or were abandoned. Literacy declined sharply outside the walls of monasteries and churches. The political unity that Rome had imposed upon diverse peoples fragmented into countless kingdoms, tribes, and warlords competing for land and power. Yet from this fragmentation, new powers emerged. Among the most formidable were the Franks, a confederation of Germanic tribes who had settled in the Roman province of Gaul. Unlike many Germanic peoples who swept through the collapsing empire only to fade from history, the Franks established a lasting kingdom. In the late 5th century, their king, Clovis, united the Frankish tribes and converted to Catholic Christianity rather than the Arian Christianity favored by many Germanic rulers. This choice would prove momentous. By embracing the faith of the Roman population and the church hierarchy, Clovis secured both religious legitimacy and the support of bishops throughout Gaul. His conversion created a partnership between the Frankish monarchy and the Catholic Church that would shape European history for centuries. The dynasty Clovis founded, known as the Merovingians, ruled the Frankish kingdom for nearly 300 years. Yet by the early 8th century, these kings had become little more than figureheads. Real power rested in the hands of officials called mayors of the palace, chief administrators who commanded armies, collected taxes, and made crucial decisions while Merovingian kings remained isolated in their royal estates. The most successful of these mayors came from a single family, the Carolingians, who would eventually replace the dynasty they served. The first Carolingian to achieve lasting fame was Charles Martel, whose very name meant Charles the Hammer. In October 732, an Islamic army that had conquered Spain and crossed the Pyrenees into Gaul met a Frankish force led by Charles Martel near the city of Tours. Medieval chroniclers would later portray this battle as a decisive clash between Christianity and Islam, a moment when the fate of Europe hung in the balance. Modern historians view it more cautiously. The engagement at Tours was significant, but it was one battle in a longer series of conflicts along the Frankish frontier with Islamic Spain. What cannot be disputed is that Charles Martel turned back the invasion and secured his reputation as the defender of Christian Europe. His victory enhanced both his personal prestige and the power of his family. Charles Martel never claimed the title of king, but his son Pepin, known as Pepin the Short, would go further. By the middle of the 8th century, the Merovingian kings had become so powerless that Pepin decided the charade should end. He sent envoys to Pope Zacharias in Rome with a question both practical and profound. Who should be king, the man who holds the title or the man who holds the power? The Pope's answer was unambiguous. In 751, with papal blessing, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king and was anointed king of the Franks. This was not merely a change of dynasty. It marked the creation of a new kind of kingship, one explicitly sanctioned by the Church and bound to it by mutual obligation. That obligation was soon tested. The popes in Rome faced military pressure from the Lombards, a Germanic people who controlled much of Italy. Unable to rely on protection from the distant Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, Pope Stephen II crossed the Alps in 754 to seek aid from Pepin. The Frankish king responded. He invaded Italy, defeated the Lombards, and donated conquered territories to the Papacy, creating what became known as the Papal States. This alliance between the Frankish throne and the Bishop of Rome would become one of the defining relationships of medieval Europe. When Pepin the Short died in 768, he left his sons not only a powerful kingdom, but also a sacred compact with the Church, and a vision of Christian kingship that transcended mere military conquest. Into this world, shaped by the collapse of Rome, the rise of the Franks, and the intertwining of royal and religious authority, stepped the man who would become the greatest ruler early medieval Europe had known. Sources used: The Inheritance of Rome by Chris Wickham, pages 165–189. Charlemagne by Rossum and McKitterick, pages 48–72. The Carolingians by Pierre Richer, pages 53–79. Early Medieval Europe 300–1000 by Roger Collins, pages 198–223. Part 2. The rise of the Frankish king Charlemagne was born in April 748, though the exact day remains unknown. Even the location of his birth is uncertain, with Aachen and several other sites claimed by later tradition. His name, Karl in his own language, meant simply a free man or warrior. We know little of his childhood. Medieval writers showed scant interest in the formative years of rulers, focusing instead on their deeds once they took power. He grew up in a world of constant warfare, traveling with his father's court as it moved from one royal estate to another, administering justice, receiving oaths of loyalty, and preparing for the next campaign. When Pepin the Short died in September 768, he divided the kingdom between his two sons according to Frankish custom. Charlemagne, the elder, received the northern and western territories, while his younger brother Carloman took the center and southeast. The division created immediate tension. The two brothers held their own courts, commanded their own armies, and pursued separate policies. In 769, when a rebellion broke out in Aquitaine, Charlemagne called upon his brother for military support. Carloman refused, and Charlemagne was forced to suppress the revolt alone. Their relationship grew increasingly strained. Civil war seemed possible, perhaps inevitable. Then in December 771, Carloman died suddenly. He was only 20 years old. The exact cause of his death is not recorded, merely that he fell ill and perished within days. Some historians have speculated about foul play, but no contemporary source suggests it, and illness was common enough in an age of limited medical knowledge. What followed Carloman's death, however, was decisive and telling. Carloman's widow fled with her young sons to the court of the Lombard king in Italy, seeking protection. The nobles who had served Carloman faced a choice. They chose Charlemagne. Within weeks, he was recognized as sole ruler of the entire Frankish kingdom. There would be no partition, no regency for infant heirs, no prolonged succession crisis. Charlemagne, at 29, held unchallenged power over the most formidable kingdom in Western Europe. He moved quickly to secure his authority. The Lombard kingdom in Italy, which had sheltered his brother's family, became both a political problem and an opportunity. The Lombards, under King Desiderius, were again threatening papal territory. In 773, Pope Hadrian I sent urgent appeals to Charlemagne for aid. The Frankish king responded as his father had done, but with greater force. He led his army across the Alps, besieged the Lombard capital of Pavia, and after a siege lasting months, forced Desiderius to surrender. Charlemagne did not install a puppet ruler or extract tribute and withdraw. Instead, he took the Iron Crown of Lombardy for himself, annexing the kingdom directly to the Frankish realm. He visited Rome during this campaign, renewing his father's donation of lands to the papacy and receiving the Pope's blessing. This pattern, military conquest joined with religious purpose, would define his reign. The young king who emerged from these early campaigns was a formidable figure. The monk Einhard, who knew Charlemagne personally and wrote his biography, described him as tall and strongly built, with a thick neck, a rather prominent stomach in later years, and a stride that was energetic but somewhat short for his height. He dressed simply, in the traditional Frankish manner, avoiding the elaborate costumes favored by Byzantine emperors or even many of his own courtiers. He was vigorous, fond of hunting and swimming, and possessed of an intellect that impressed the scholars he gathered at his court. Yet he was also ruthless when he judged ruthlessness necessary. His reign would be marked by almost constant warfare, expansion, and the imposition of his will across vast territories. The question that would define his legacy was not whether he was powerful, but how he would use that power and to what end. Sources used: Einhard, The Life of Charlemagne, translated by David Gantz, pages 1533. Charlemagne by Roger Collins, pages 2357. The Royal Frankish Annals, translated by Bernard Walter Scalls, pages 3552. Charlemagne by Rosamund McKitterick, pages 91-114. Part 3. Conquest, Expansion. An empire. The defining military struggle of Charlemagne's reign began in 772 and would not end for more than 30 years. The Saxons, a pagan Germanic people inhabiting the region between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers, lived in loosely organized tribal groups without kings or centralized authority. They raided Frankish territory, resisted conversion to Christianity, and rejected Frankish overlordship. For Charlemagne, their subjugation became both a strategic necessity and a religious mission. The Saxon Wars were brutal. Charlemagne led campaign after campaign into Saxon territory, burning villages, destroying pagan shrines, and demanding submission and baptism. The Saxons, led at various times by a chieftain named Widukind, resisted fiercely. They would submit when Frankish armies arrived, accept baptism, and swear oaths of loyalty, then rebel as soon as the Frankish forces withdrew. In 782, frustration reached a breaking point. After a Saxon uprising killed several Frankish nobles, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners at Verdun. This massacre, recorded in the Royal Frankish Annals, has been debated by historians. Some scholars question the number, suggesting scribal error or exaggeration, but the event itself is well attested and remains one of the darkest episodes of Charlemagne's reign. The Frankish king imposed harsh laws on the Saxons. His capitulary for Saxony prescribed death for refusing baptism, for cremating the dead according to pagan custom, for eating meat during Lent, and for conspiring against Christians. These laws shocked even some contemporaries and have troubled historians ever since. The forced conversion of the Saxons stands in tension with the image of Charlemagne as a Christian reformer and defender of the Church. It raises difficult questions about the methods he employed and the human cost of his vision of a unified Christian Europe. By 804, Saxon resistance was finally broken. The region was incorporated into the Frankish kingdom, churches and monasteries were established, and Frankish administrators imposed order. Widukind himself submitted, was baptized with Charlemagne as his godfather, and disappears from the historical record. The conquest was complete, but the controversy surrounding its methods endures. While fighting the Saxons, Charlemagne expanded his realm in other directions. In 778, he led an expedition into Spain, hoping to exploit divisions among Muslim rulers and extend Frankish influence south of the Pyrenees. The campaign achieved little. On the return journey, the rearguard of his army, commanded by a Frankish noble named Roland, was ambushed and annihilated by Basque forces in the Pyrenees at a place called Roncesvalles. This minor military setback would be transformed by later poets into the epic Song of Roland, one of the great literary works of the Middle Ages. But at the time, it was simply a reminder that even Charlemagne's power had limits. In the east, Charlemagne waged war against the Avars, a nomadic people who controlled the middle Danube basin and had accumulated vast treasure through centuries of raiding and tribute-taking. Between 791 and 803, Frankish armies systematically dismantled Avar power, captured their fortified ring strongholds, and seized enormous quantities of gold, silver, and precious objects. The wealth taken from the Avars enriched Charlemagne's court and funded his building projects, while the destruction of Avar power opened the Danube region to Frankish influence and Christian missionary activity. By the end of the 8th century, Charlemagne ruled a realm that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Elbe River, from the North Sea to central Italy and the Pyrenees. He commanded the largest territory under a single ruler in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. Yet this was not an empire in the Roman sense. It was a patchwork of peoples, laws, languages, and customs held together by the king's personal authority, his network of counts and bishops, his traveling court, and his relentless energy. He spent much of each year on the move, dispensing justice, receiving oaths, inspecting fortifications, and leading armies. The administration of such a realm required not only military might, but also a system of governance that could function across vast distances and diverse populations. Sources used: The Royal Frankish Annals, translated by Bernard Walter Scales, pages 59-87. Charlemagne by Roger Collins, pages 107-146. Charlemagne's Early Campaigns, 768-777, edited by Paul Foraker, pages 134-158. The Age of Charlemagne by Donald Bullough, pages 89-112. Part 4, Emperor and Reformer on Christmas Day in the year 800. Charlemagne attended Mass at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. As he rose from prayer before the altar, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head, and the assembled Romans acclaimed him as Emperor and Augustus. According to Einhard, Charlemagne later claimed he would not have entered the church that day had he known what the Pope intended. Modern historians debate the sincerity of this statement. Some see it as genuine surprise, others as a diplomatic fiction meant to avoid offending the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, who considered themselves the sole legitimate heirs of Rome. Most scholars today believe that while the exact moment may have been staged by the Pope, Charlemagne was fully aware that some form of imperial coronation was planned. The creation of a new Western emperor was a momentous event. It declared that the political unity of the Christian West could be restored, that the memory of Rome had not died, and that the Frankish king stood as protector of the Church and the heir to imperial tradition. The Byzantine Empire, which had never relinquished its claim to universal authority, reacted with predictable outrage. It took years of negotiation before Constantinople grudgingly acknowledged Charlemagne's imperial title, and even then only as a courtesy rather than a recognition of equal status. Charlemagne did not merely conquer, he reformed. His government issued numerous capitularies, legislative decrees covering matters ranging from judicial procedure to agricultural practices, from monastic discipline to weights and measures. These laws sought to impose order and standardization across his diverse realm. He appointed counts to administer regions and created missi dominici, royal envoys who traveled in pairs, one lay and one ecclesiastical, to inspect local administration, hear complaints, and ensure that royal commands were obeyed. The system was ambitious, but its effectiveness varied greatly depending on distance from the royal court and the competence and loyalty of individual officials. Education became a central concern of Charlemagne's reign. When he came to power, literacy was rare even among the clergy. Many priests could barely read the Latin prayers they recited. Charlemagne recognized that effective administration and religious reform required educated men. He issued decrees ordering bishops and monasteries to establish schools. He gathered scholars from across Europe to his court, including Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian monk who became his chief educational advisor. Alcuin oversaw the palace school, reformed handwriting to create the clear Carolingian minuscule script, and supervised the copying and correction of key texts, including the Bible and the Rule of Saint Benedict. This intellectual revival, known to historians as the Carolingian Renaissance, produced no original philosophy or scientific discovery comparable to later Renaissances. Its achievement was preservation and standardization. Monasteries across the empire set up scriptoria where monks copied classical Latin texts, patristic writings, and legal documents. Much of what survives of ancient Latin literature exists because Carolingian scribes copied it. Charlemagne himself learned to read, though Einhard tells us he tried to learn to write in his later years, keeping tablets under his pillow to practice forming letters, but began too late in life to achieve much skill. Religious reform accompanied educational efforts. Charlemagne enforced clerical discipline, suppressed heresy, regulated monasteries, and insisted on doctrinal uniformity. He convened church councils, appointed bishops, and saw himself as responsible not only for the physical safety of Christians, but for the spiritual health of the church itself. This vision of royal theocracy, the king as God's appointed agent for the governance of Christian society, became a defining feature of medieval kingship. Economic activity revived under Charlemagne's rule, though Europe remained overwhelmingly rural and poor by later standards. He reformed coinage, improved roads, encouraged trade, and enforced laws protecting merchants. He built a palace complex at Aachen, his favored residence, that included a great hall, a chapel modeled on Byzantine architecture, and heated baths supplied by natural hot springs. Aachen became the symbolic center of his empire, a physical manifestation of his ambition to create a new Rome in the heart of Francia. The man who died in 814 had transformed Western Europe. He had expanded the Frankish kingdom into an empire, revived learning, strengthened the church, codified laws, and created administrative structures that would outlast his dynasty. He earned his later title, Charlemagne, Charles the Great. Yet he remained in many ways a man of his time, a warrior king, illiterate until adulthood, convinced of the righteousness of forced conversion, and willing to employ mass violence to achieve his ends. Understanding Charlemagne requires holding both truths in view. Sources used: Einhard, The Life of Charlemagne, translated by David Gantz, pages 44-67. Charlemagne by Rosamund Makitarik, pages 292-327. The Carolingian Renaissance by John Contreni, pages 58-94. Alcuin of York, Letters, selected and translated in Carolingian Civilization. A Reader, pages 103-125. Part 5, Death, Legacy, and the Making of Medieval Europe in the Winter of 813. Charlemagne, now in his mid-60s and visibly weakening, summoned his only surviving legitimate son, Louis, to Aachen. Before an assembly of Frankish nobles, he personally placed the imperial crown on Louis's head, making him co-emperor without waiting for papal involvement. It was a deliberate choice, asserting that the imperial dignity belonged to the Carolingian family and did not require validation from Rome. 4 months later, on January 28, 814, Charlemagne died after a brief illness, likely pleurisy. He was buried the same day in the chapel at Aachen, dressed in his imperial robes, seated on a throne, with a copy of the Gospels on his lap and his sword at his side. This detail comes from later chronicles and may be more legend than fact, but it captured how subsequent generations wished to remember him. Louis, known to history as Louis the Pious, inherited the empire intact but lacked his father's forceful personality and military skill. His reign was troubled by rebellions, including uprisings by his own sons, and by disputes over succession. When Louis died in 840, civil war broke out among his sons. In 843, they signed the Treaty of Verdun, dividing the Carolingian Empire into 3 kingdoms. Charles the Bald received West Francia, roughly corresponding to modern France. Louis the German took East Francia, the foundation of what would become Germany. Lothair, the eldest, received the imperial title and a narrow middle kingdom stretching from the North Sea through Lotharingia and Burgundy into Italy. This middle kingdom, lacking natural borders or ethnic unity, fragmented within decades. The division at Verdun marked the beginning of the end of Carolingian unity and the emergence of the political map of medieval Europe. Yet Charlemagne's legacy outlasted his empire. The idea of a unified Christian Europe under a single emperor, sanctioned by the Church, became a persistent dream. In 962, the German King Otto I was crowned emperor in Rome, consciously reviving the Carolingian imperial tradition and creating what later historians called the Holy Roman Empire. This institution, neither holy nor Roman nor particularly effective as an empire, endured until 1806, always looking back to Charlemagne as its symbolic founder. The administrative and legal structures Charlemagne established influenced European governance for centuries. His emphasis on written law, royal supervision of local officials, and the partnership between throne and altar became models for medieval kingship. The Carolingian Renaissance preserved texts and learning that might otherwise have vanished, creating a foundation for later intellectual revivals. The script developed under his patronage remained the standard for medieval manuscripts and influenced the development of modern lowercase letters. Charlemagne's conquests and forced conversion spread Christianity throughout Central Europe, shaping the religious geography of the continent. The methods he employed, particularly against the Saxons, remained deeply controversial. Medieval writers praised him as a champion of the faith. Modern historians acknowledge his achievements while recognizing the violence and coercion that accompanied them. He cannot be neatly categorized as simply hero or villain. He was a successful king who expanded his realm, strengthened institutions, patronized learning, and allied with the church, but who also waged brutal wars, ordered massacres, and imposed his religion and rule by force. Later generations transformed Charlemagne into legend. French chansons de geste portrayed him as a saintly warrior king, protagonist of the Song of Roland and countless other epics. German tradition claimed him as Karl der Grosse, founder of their imperial heritage. The Catholic Church beatified him, though not formally canonizing him as a saint. Napoleon Bonaparte consciously imitated Carolingian imagery, and the architects of modern European unity invoked Charlemagne as a symbol of a continent transcending national divisions. The historical Charlemagne, stripped of legend, remains one of the most influential rulers in European history. He did not unite Europe, that unity dissolved within a generation of his death, but he created a vision of what such unity might look like, and provided a historical reference point that shaped political imagination for 1,000 years. He did not cause the Middle Ages. That period was already well underway when he was born, but he gave it institutional and cultural forms that defined medieval civilization. He did not save learning single-handedly, but his patronage preserved texts and established educational practices that kept literacy alive during the early medieval centuries. In the end, Charlemagne's significance lies not in matching the legend that later grew around him, but in the concrete achievements of his reign and their enduring consequences. He transformed the Frankish kingdom into the dominant power in Western Europe. He forged a working alliance between royal authority and the church that became a foundation of medieval politics. He revived education and learning when both were in serious decline. He created administrative systems that, however imperfectly, governed a vast realm. He expanded the boundaries of Christendom and defended it against external enemies. And he left a legacy, both inspiring and troubling, that shaped how Europeans understood power, faith, empire, and their own past for generations to come. Sources used: Einhard, The Life of Charlemagne, translated by David Gantz. Pages 68-79 Charlemagne by Roger Collins. Pages 147-176 Charlemagne, The Formation of a European Identity by Rosamund McKitterick. Pages 380-412. The Inheritance of Rome by Chris Wickham. Pages 400-429.